The evidence denied the crime ever happened, yet someone is dead. Welcome to Holmes Mystery. I am your host, Lucien Moreau. Let me know your location in the comments. Your words make this better. Let's begin. The hansom cab carried us swiftly through the dense London fog, its wheels muffled upon the dampened streets. I sat opposite Holmes, observing the peculiar stillness that had overtaken him. His eyes were half closed, yet I knew well that his mind was in the most vigorous activity, assembling, testing, and discarding possibilities with that extraordinary precision which so often left me in awe. "It is the contradiction that interests you most, is it not?" I ventured at last. Holmes did not open his eyes. "Contradiction, Watson, is merely the outward appearance of incomplete understanding," said he. "When what we have here is not a contradiction but a misdirection, one that has been most carefully constructed." "You believe, then, that this was murder?" "My dear fellow," he replied, opening his eyes and fixing me with a faint smile, "I believe nothing. I observe, I infer, and I conclude. Belief is a luxury I cannot afford." Before I could press him further, the cab came to a halt before an imposing residence of dark brick and tall, narrow windows. A constable stood at the gate, and beyond him I could just discern the faint glow of lamplight within. "Sir Alister Pembroke's residence?" Holmes murmured, stepping out onto the pavement. Inspector Lestrade was already waiting for us at the door, his impatience evident in the quickness of his movements. "You've come at last," he said. "The scene is untouched, or just as you requested." "Excellent," said Holmes. "Then we may hope the truth has not yet been disturbed by well-meaning interference." We were led through a richly appointed hallway, adorned with portraits whose stern gazes seemed to follow us as we passed. The air within was heavy, as though the house itself were reluctant to surrender its secrets. "The study is this way," said Lestrade, lowering his voice. He opened a door at the end of the corridor, and we entered the room in which the strange affair had unfolded. It was a spacious chamber, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large writing desk near the centre. A single lamp cast a steady light across the scene, illuminating the figure of Sir Alister Pembroke, who remained seated in a high-backed chair. I shall not soon forget the sight. And the man's face was contorted in a manner that spoke unmistakably of sudden and violent distress. His hand lay upon the desk, fingers curled, as though grasping at something that had eluded him in his final moments. Holmes approached the body without hesitation, his expression one of calm detachment. "You haven't moved him?" he asked. "Not an inch," said Lestrade. Holmes nodded and bent slightly, examining the features with close attention. Then he turned to the desk, where a glass and decanter stood neatly arranged. "And this," he said, gesturing toward them, "has been tested?" "Twice," Lestrade replied. "No poison whatsoever." Holmes lifted the glass delicately, holding it to the light. "No residue," he murmured, "no discoloration, and yet the man is dead of poison." He set the glass down and began to move slowly about the room, his gaze passing over every surface with meticulous care. I followed, though I confess that to my eyes there was little to remark upon. The windows were closed and latched from within. The curtains were drawn. The fireplace contained only the faint remains of a dying fire. Everything appeared orderly, almost unnaturally so. "Too tidy?" Holmes said suddenly. Lestrade looked up. "I beg your pardon?" Holmes gestured lightly about the room. "There is a curious absence of disorder," he explained. "A man in the throes of sudden poisoning does not die so neatly. One expects some sign of struggle, an overturned chair, a disturbed object, something to mark the violence of the event." "But the servant heard a cry," said Lestrade. "Surely that indicates distress." "A cry, yes," Holmes replied. But distress alone does not account for this remarkable composure of the surroundings. He moved to the fireplace and knelt, sifting gently through the ashes with the tip of his cane. "Was anything burned here?" he asked. "Nothing of note," said Lestrade. "A few papers, perhaps. The servant could not say." Holmes said nothing, but I noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes, a sign, I had learned, that he had found something of interest, though he chose not yet to reveal it. He rose and crossed to the writing desk, where several documents lay arranged in careful order. Among them was a sheet of paper, upon which a few lines had been hastily written. Holmes picked it up and read, silently. "Well?" I asked. "A fragment," he said, handing it to me. I read the words with growing unease. It was not meant for me. The sentence trailed off, and as though the writer had been interrupted before completing the thought. "Written by the deceased?" I asked. "So it would appear," said Holmes. "The handwriting matches that of other documents in the room." Lestrade leaned forward. "We took that as evidence that he realized he had been poisoned," he said. "Perhaps he meant that the poison was intended for someone else." Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he turned his attention to the inkstand upon the desk. "Fresh," he murmured. "Very fresh." "Of course it is," said Lestrade. "He wrote it moments before his death." "Perhaps," Holmes said softly. He then did a most curious thing. He dipped the pen lightly into the ink and drew a small line upon a scrap of paper. Holding it up to the light, he compared it closely with the writing on the note. For a moment he said nothing, but then he placed both pen and paper down with deliberate care. "Lestrade," he said at last, "you are quite certain that no poison was found anywhere in this room?" "Absolutely certain." "And no one entered or left after the door was locked?" "No one." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we are faced with a most interesting conclusion," he said. "And what is that?" Lestrade asked impatiently. Holmes turned toward him, his expression composed, yet his eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "That Sir Alistair Pembroke," said he, "did not die as a result of anything present in this room." A silence followed, heavy and uncertain. "Then how in heaven's name did he die?" I exclaimed. Holmes glanced once more about the study, his gaze lingering briefly upon the fireplace, the desk, and finally the lifeless figure in the chair. "That, my dear Watson," he said, "is precisely the question we must now answer, and I suspect that the answer lies not in what we see here, but in what is conspicuously absent." At this, he turned abruptly toward the door. "Come, Lestrade," he added. "There is someone in this house who has already told us more than he intended. We have only to listen more carefully." Lestrade cast me a glance of mingled irritation and curiosity, but Holmes had already crossed the threshold and was making his way briskly down the corridor. There was in his manner that peculiar urgency which I had learned to associate with the moment when some hidden pattern had begun to emerge in his mind, though still incomplete. "The servant who heard the cry," Holmes said over his shoulder. "I should like to speak with him, or her, without delay." "A footman," Lestrade replied, quickening his pace to keep up. "Name of Carter." He was the first to raise the alarm. We found the man in a small sitting room adjacent to the servants' quarters. He rose nervously at our entrance, twisting his cap between his hands. He was of middle age, with a pale complexion, and eyes that darted from one to another of us with evident unease. "This is Mr. Carter," said Lestrade. "Now then, tell Mr. Holmes what you told me." Holmes did not sit, but stood directly before the man, his gaze steady and penetrating. "You heard a cry," he said. "At what precise time?" Carter swallowed. Just after 9, sir. I was in the passage, see, when I heard it, sharp-like, as if the master had been startled or in pain. And what did you do? I went at once to the study door, sir. It was locked. I called out, but there was no answer. Then I fetched the others, and we forced it open. Holmes nodded slightly. How long elapsed between the cry and your forcing the door? Not more than a minute or two, sir. And during that time, did you hear anything else? Movement, perhaps? The sound of glass? A chair? Anything of the sort? Carter hesitated. No, sir. Nothing at all. Holmes's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Nothing, he repeated. You are quite certain? Yes, sir. Holmes turned away from him abruptly and began to pace the room. A single cry, he murmured. No subsequent disturbance. A rapid death, then, very rapid indeed. Lestrade folded his arms. That is consistent with the poison, he said. It acts within seconds. Indeed, said Holmes absently, and yet our difficulty remains the absence of its administration. He stopped and faced Carter once more. Tell me, he said, who last attended Sir Alistair before his death? That would be Mrs. Wilcox, sir, the housekeeper. She brought him his evening tray. At what time? Shortly before 9. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with Lestrade. I should like to speak with her, he said. Mrs. Wilcox proved to be a woman of composed demeanour, though I detected beneath her calm exterior a certain tension. She received us in the same room, folding her hands neatly before her as she listened to Holmes's questions. You brought Sir Alistair his tray, Holmes began. What did it contain? A glass of port, sir, and a light supper, cold meats and bread, she replied. And you are certain that nothing unusual was added? Quite certain, sir. I prepared it myself. Holmes inclined his head. And when you entered the study, how did you find Sir Alistair? He was seated at his desk, sir, reading. He seemed quite well. Did he say anything to you? Only that he was not to be disturbed. Holmes paused. Not to be disturbed, he repeated softly. And yet within minutes he cries out and is found dead. Mrs. Wilcox lowered her gaze. It was a terrible shock, sir. I do not doubt it, said Holmes. One more question, if you please. Did Sir Alistair receive any visitors that evening? No, sir. None that I am aware of. Holmes regarded her thoughtfully for a moment longer, then dismissed her with a slight nod. When she had gone, Lestrade gave a short laugh. Well, there you have it, Mr. Holmes. No visitors, no poison, and a locked room. If you can make sense of that, you are a better man than I. Holmes did not immediately respond, yet he had moved to the window at the end of the passage and was examining the latch with great care. Perfectly secure, he said at last. No tampering whatsoever. Exactly, said Lestrade. No one could have entered or left. Holmes turned back toward us, his expression now one of quiet intensity. And yet, he said, someone or something did. Lestrade threw up his hands. There you go again with your impossibilities. Holmes smiled faintly. Not impossibilities, Lestrade, improbabilities, and there is a great difference between the two. He returned to the study, and I followed close behind, eager not to miss any detail of his investigation. The room seemed unchanged, yet I could not shake the feeling that Holmes now saw within it something entirely different from what had first presented itself to us. So he went directly to the writing desk and once more took up the unfinished note. It was not meant for me. Holmes tapped the paper lightly. Watson, he said, what do you make of this? It suggests, I replied, that Sir Alistair believed the poison was intended for another. Just so, said Holmes, and yet we have found no poison in his drink, his food, or anywhere in this room. Then the statement must be mistaken, I said. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, The dying words of a man are seldom mistaken. They are, if anything, the most truthful expressions he can offer. He placed the note back upon the desk. Consider instead, he continued, that the statement is accurate, but incomplete. Incomplete? Yes, Sir Alistair believed that something was not meant for him. The question is what? I pondered this, but could arrive at no satisfactory answer. Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to the fireplace. Once again, he knelt and examined the ashes with meticulous care. This time, however, he produced from his pocket a small lens, through which he scrutinized the contents more closely. After a moment he gave a soft exclamation. "Ah!" Lestrade leaned forward. "What is it?" Holmes rose slowly, holding between his fingers a tiny blackened fragment. "Paper," he said. "But not ordinary paper." He handed it to me, and I observed that it was unusually thick, with a faint, glossy surface. "Card, perhaps?" I suggested. "Precisely," said Holmes, "and burned very recently." Lestrade frowned. "But we already knew that papers had been burned." "Did we?" Holmes replied. "Or did we assume it?" Lestrade hesitated. Holmes continued, in his voice now carrying a note of quiet triumph. "This fragment, Lestrade, is not from a document. It is from a container, one designed to hold something of importance." "A container?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "And if I am not greatly mistaken," he added, "it once held the very substance which has so inconveniently vanished from this room." Lestrade stared at him. "You mean the poison?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I mean," said he, "that the poison was here, Lestrade. It was administered, and then it was removed." A silence fell upon us, broken only by the faint crackle of the dying fire. "But that is impossible," Lestrade insisted. "No one entered the room." Holmes slipped the fragment into his pocket. "On the contrary," he said softly, "someone did, or else, or something far more ingenious occurred." He glanced once more at the lifeless figure in the chair. "And until we understand precisely how that poison was delivered and how it disappeared, we shall remain as much in the dark as when we first arrived." I felt then a curious thrill, for I knew that we stood upon the threshold of a deeper mystery, one in which each answer would only give rise to further questions. And as I looked at Holmes, I saw that he relished it utterly. Holmes remained standing beside the hearth for several moments after his last remark, his long fingers lightly touching one another, as though feeling for some invisible thread that bound the facts together. Lestrade, however, was not so patient. "Removed?" he repeated. "And by whom, pray? The man was alone, the door locked, the windows secured. Are we to suppose that the poison simply vanished into thin air?" Holmes cast him a sidelong glance. "My dear Lestrade, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The poison did not vanish. It was consumed, destroyed, or carried away. Each of these possibilities implies an agent." "And that agent could not have been present," Lestrade insisted. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we must reconsider what we mean by present." I confess that this remark did little to clarify matters for me, and judging by Lestrade's expression, he was no better enlightened. Holmes, however, had already moved on. He crossed once more to the desk and began a more thorough examination of its contents, opening drawers, inspecting papers, and pausing occasionally to study some detail which escaped my notice entirely. "Watson," said he suddenly, "you observed the position of the body when we entered?" "Yes, seated upright facing the desk." "And the hand?" "Resting upon the surface, as though he had been writing." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. Now consider this. A man seized by a violent poison, one acting within seconds, cries out once and yet remains seated with no sign of having risen, staggered, or attempted to flee. That is true, I admitted. It is most peculiar. It is more than peculiar, said Holmes. It is instructive. Lestrade gave an impatient snort. Instructive of what? Holmes turned to him. That Sir Alistair did not perceive the danger until it was already upon him, he said. There was no interval, no warning. The agent acted at the very instant of exposure. Which is consistent with the poison, Lestrade said. Yes, but not with its supposed method of delivery, Holmes replied. A poisoned drink, for example, would require the act of swallowing, a brief delay, and then the onset of symptoms. Yet here we have something far more immediate. I felt a stir of comprehension, though still incomplete. You mean, I said slowly, that the poison was not ingested? Holmes's eyes flashed with approval. Exactly, Watson. Not ingested in the conventional sense. Lestrade stared at him. Then how? Holmes raised a hand. Let us not anticipate. We must proceed step by step. He returned to the fireplace once more, though this time his attention was not upon the ashes, but upon the mantel above. There stood a number of small objects, a clock, or a pair of candlesticks, and several framed photographs. Holmes lifted one of the photographs and examined it closely. A family portrait, he said. Sir Alistair, a younger man beside him, perhaps a nephew, and a lady. The nephew is Mr. Edward Pembroke, said Lestrade. He inherits the estate. Holmes replaced the photograph with care. And where is this Mr. Edward now? In the house, Lestrade replied. Naturally, he was questioned. His account is straightforward. He was in the dining room at the time of the incident, with two other guests. Ah, guests, Holmes murmured. And who might they be? A Mr. Lionel Graves and a Miss Clara Whitcomb. Holmes turned back toward the desk. A most interesting household, he said. A wealthy man, an heir, and visitors present at the time of death. One might almost suspect a motive. Lestrade seized upon this eagerly. Exactly. The nephew stands to gain everything. Holmes gave a slight shake of his head. Too obvious, Lestrade. When a case presents us with a ready-made motive, we must be doubly cautious. It is often placed there to distract. Or it may simply be the truth, Lestrade retorted. Indeed, said Holmes, but we shall not know which until we have examined it more closely. He opened one of the drawers of the desk and withdrew a small ledger. Flipping through its pages, he paused at an entry near the end. Financial records, he said. Sir Alistair appears to have been engaged in some rather substantial transactions of late. Of what nature? I asked. Holmes ran his finger down the page. Investments, some of them quite speculative. And here, he tapped the paper lightly, a series of payments to a name that recurs with notable frequency, L. Graves. Lestrade's eyes widened. One of the guests? Precisely, said Holmes. A man who receives regular payments from the deceased and who happens to be present on the evening of his death. That, Lestrade, is a coincidence worthy of attention. Lestrade's earlier skepticism began to give way to renewed interest. You think this Graves fellow may be involved? I think, Holmes replied, that he must be questioned with the utmost care. He closed the ledger and returned it to the drawer. But before we do so, he added, there is still one matter which troubles me deeply. And what is that? I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted once more to the body. The note, he said quietly. It was not meant for me. Yes, I said. Yeah, do you believe it to be significant? It is more than significant, Holmes replied. It is the key to the entire affair." Lestrade frowned. But if the poison was intended for someone else, then Sir Alistair was merely an unfortunate victim. Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, Lestrade, that is the conclusion you are meant to draw." "Meant to draw?" Holmes' expression grew grave. "Yes, the phrasing is too convenient, too suggestive. It directs us toward a particular interpretation, one which may not be the correct one." "Then you believe the note was misleading?" I said. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps it was written under a misapprehension." He stepped closer to the desk and placed his hand lightly upon its surface. "Imagine, Watson, that a man encounters something unexpected, something he does not fully understand. In his final moments, he attempts to record his realization, but lacks the time to complete the thought." "You mean," I said, "that he may have been mistaken about what was not meant for him?" "Exactly." A chill passed through me at the implication. Holmes straightened and turned toward Lestrade. "We must speak with Mr. Graves, Miss Whitcomb, and the nephew," he said, "individually and without delay. One of them, I suspect, holds a piece of this puzzle, whether knowingly or not." Lestrade nodded. "They are all in the drawing-room." Holmes took up his hat, his expression once more composed, though I could see beneath it the unmistakable spark of anticipation. "Then let us proceed," he said. "For I begin to perceive the outline of a design, one that is at once subtle, ingenious, and exceedingly dangerous." And with that, out we left the study behind us, carrying with us not only the enigma of a death without a visible cause, but the growing certainty that the truth, when revealed, would prove far stranger than any of us had yet imagined. We found the three occupants of the drawing-room precisely as Lestrade had indicated, seated in a strained silence that spoke more eloquently than any words. The atmosphere was heavy with unease, as though each of them sensed that suspicion hovered over the group, yet none dared give it voice. Mr. Edward Pembroke rose at once as we entered. He was a young man of perhaps 25, well-dressed and composed, though his pallor betrayed the shock of recent events. "This is most distressing," he said. "I trust, Inspector, that some progress has been made?" Lestrade made a vague gesture toward Holmes. "Mr. Holmes is assisting us," he said. At the mention of that name, all three turned their attention toward my companion. Mr. Lionel Graves, a man of middle years with sharp features and restless eyes, regarded Holmes with a look of guarded interest. Miss Clara Whitcomb, by contrast, seemed anxious rather than curious, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I regret the circumstances under which we meet," he said. "However, it is necessary that I ask each of you a few questions. I trust you will oblige me." There was a murmur of assent. "Excellent," Holmes continued. "Mr. Pembroke, perhaps you would be so good as to begin. You were in the dining-room at the time of your uncle's death." "Yes," said Edward. "Kate, we had just finished supper." "And your companions were with you throughout?" "From shortly before 9 until the alarm was raised, yes." Holmes nodded. "And during that time, did anyone leave the room, even briefly?" Edward hesitated for the briefest instant. "No," he said at last. "We remained together." Holmes' eyes flickered toward Mr. Graves. "And you, sir, do you confirm this?" Graves gave a short nod. "Entirely. We were discussing a business matter when we heard the cry." "A business matter," Holmes repeated. "Of what nature?" Graves leaned back slightly, as though weighing his words. "An investment," he said. "Sir Alistair had entrusted me with certain financial opportunities." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Indeed, I have seen reference to your name in his ledger." Graves's expression did not change, but I noticed the slightest tightening at the corners of his mouth. "Then you are aware," he said, "that our dealings were entirely legitimate." "I am aware," Holmes replied calmly, "that they were frequent." A silence followed, during which Miss Whitcomb shifted uneasily. Holmes turned to her. "And you, Miss Whitcomb, you were present throughout as well?" "Yes," she said quickly. "I did not leave the room." Her voice carried a note of urgency which did not escape Holmes's notice. "You seem anxious to make that clear," he observed. I merely wish to assist," she said. Holmes studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Quite so." He moved a few steps closer to the group, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. "Now," he said, "let us consider the sequence of events. You were in the dining room. Sir Alistair was in his study, I having instructed that he was not to be disturbed. Then, at approximately 9 o'clock, a cry is heard. Within minutes, the door is forced open, and he is found dead." "Yes," said Edward, "that is correct." Holmes inclined his head. "And none of you heard anything else? No movement, no voices, nothing beyond that single cry?" "Nothing," said Graves. Miss Whitcomb nodded in agreement. Holmes was silent for a moment, then spoke again. "And yet," he said, "there is one aspect of this matter which I find most curious." Edward looked at him. "And what is that?" Holmes' gaze moved deliberately from one to the other. "That all three of you are so very certain." A faint tension entered the room. "I beg your pardon," said Graves. Holmes smiled faintly. "In my experience," he said, "certainty is a rare commodity, particularly in moments of shock and confusion, and yet each of you recalls with perfect clarity that no one left the room." "Well, it is true," Edward said, a trace of defensiveness in his tone. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "or perhaps it is simply convenient." Lestrade shifted slightly, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Mr. Holmes," he began. Holmes raised a hand. "Pray do not misunderstand me," he said smoothly. "I do not suggest that any of you are deliberately misleading us, but memory, as you know, can be influenced by many factors: assumption, expectation, even suggestion." He turned once more to Graves. "You say you were discussing a business matter. Was it of importance?" "Of considerable importance," Graves replied. "Then I imagine it occupied your attention fully." "Of course," Holmes nodded. "And you, Miss Whitcomb, were you engaged in this discussion?" "No," she said. "I was merely listening." "Ah," said Holmes. "Then your attention may have wandered." She looked startled. "I do not believe so." "No?" Holmes said gently. "Not even for a moment?" She hesitated. I cannot be certain." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Precisely." He turned back toward Edward. "And you, Mr. Pembroke, were you entirely focused upon the conversation?" Edward drew himself up. "I believe so." "But you cannot swear it?" Holmes pressed. Edward faltered. "No, I suppose not absolutely." Holmes stepped back slightly as though satisfied. "Then we may conclude," he said, that the possibility, however slight, that one of you left the room has not been entirely excluded." Lestrade frowned. "But the time was so short." "Time," Holmes interrupted. "It's a most elastic concept, Lestrade. A minute may suffice for a great many things, particularly when one is determined." Graves's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting," he said, "that one of us entered the study, administered poison, and returned without being noticed?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "I am suggesting," he said, "that we must not dismiss any possibility prematurely." A silence followed, charged with unspoken tension. Then Holmes did a curious thing. He stepped toward the fireplace in the drawing room and glanced briefly at its contents, though there was nothing remarkable to be seen. When he turned back, his expression had altered, only slightly, yet enough for me to recognize that some new idea had taken hold. "Tell me," he said suddenly, "did Sir Alistair receive any letters this evening?" Edward looked puzzled. I believe so. There was the usual post." "And where are these letters now?" "In his study, I should think." Holmes inclined his head. "Then we must examine them." He moved toward the door, but paused and looked back once more at the three figures before him. "There is one final point," he said quietly. "Sir Alistair's last written words were these: 'It was not meant for me.'" A visible reaction passed across Miss Whitcomb's face, so fleeting that another might have missed it, but not Holmes. He fixed her with a steady gaze. "Does that phrase hold any meaning for you, Miss Whitcomb?" She lowered her eyes. "No," she said. Holmes held her in silence for a moment longer, then inclined his head slightly. "Very well." And with that, he turned and left the room. As I followed him back toward the study, I could not shake the impression that, although no direct accusation had been made, something in that room had shifted irrevocably, that beneath the surface of polite composure, cracks had begun to appear. Holmes, walking ahead of me, seemed to sense it as well. "The truth, Watson," he said softly, "is beginning to stir." Holmes did not speak again until we had re-entered the study and closed the door behind us. The stillness of the room seemed heavier now, as though the presence of death had grown more pronounced in our brief absence. Lestrade followed close at our heels. "Well," he said in a low voice, "did you see anything of use in there?" Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate care and placed them upon the desk. "I saw enough," he replied. "More, perhaps, than our friends intended." "You think one of them is lying?" Lestrade pressed. Holmes gave a faint shrug. "Not lying, unnecessarily, but withholding, consciously or otherwise, and that in a case such as this is often more revealing." He turned his attention at once to the desk, gathering the letters which had been left neatly arranged near the inkstand. "Now," he continued, "let us examine these communications. If Sir Alistair received anything of significance this evening, it may well be among them." I drew closer as Holmes began to sort through the envelopes, opening each with a swift and practiced motion. Most appeared to be of a routine nature, bills, invitations, and correspondence of a social kind. Holmes dismissed these with barely a glance. At length, however, he paused. "This is more interesting," he said. He held up a small envelope of thick, cream-coloured paper. It bore no sender's name, only Sir Alistair's address written in a firm, angular hand. "Delivered today?" I asked. "Indeed," said Holmes, "and if I'm not mistaken, opened very recently." He withdrew the contents, a single card, and held it up to the light. I leaned in, but could discern little beyond a faint marking upon its surface. "What is it?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the lamp and adjusted it slightly, allowing the light to fall more directly upon the card. "There," he said quietly. "Observe." I looked more closely and saw that the card bore a subtle discoloration, almost imperceptible, yet distinct once pointed out. "A stain?" I suggested. "Not a stain," said Holmes. "A residue." Lestrade frowned. "Of what?" Holmes's expression grew intent. "That," he said, "is the very question." He placed the card carefully upon the desk and reached for his lens. For several moments he examined it in silence, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. At last he straightened. "Watson," he said, "you recall my earlier remark that the poison may not have been ingested in the usual manner?" "Yes," I replied. Holmes tapped the card lightly with his finger. I believe we are now in a position to refine that hypothesis. Lestrade leaned forward. You mean that this card? Holmes nodded. May have been the vehicle of delivery. I confess that I stared at him in astonishment. But that is impossible, I said. How could a mere card? Holmes raised a hand. Consider, Watson, he said, that certain substances may be absorbed through contact, particularly when they are of sufficient potency. Lestrade's eyes widened. You mean to say that he poisoned himself simply by handling it? Not intentionally, Holmes replied, but yes, by contact. He gestured toward the desk. Sir Alistair receives this letter. He opens it, removes the card, and examines it. In doing so, he comes into contact with a substance applied to its surface, a substance capable of acting with extraordinary rapidity. I felt a chill run through me. And then? He returns to his desk, Holmes continued. Perhaps he senses something amiss, some sudden, inexplicable sensation. He attempts to write, "It was not meant for me." But before he can complete the thought, the poison takes effect. He cries out once, and then nothing. Lestrade exhaled sharply. But if that is so, why is there no trace of the poison on the card now? Holmes smiled faintly. An excellent question, Lestrade, and one which brings us back to our earlier observation. The burning, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. The container, likely a protective covering for this card, was destroyed in the fireplace, but the card itself remains. Lestrade shook his head. But you said the poison was removed. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And so it was. For consider, if the substance was volatile or reactive, it may well have dissipated after fulfilling its purpose. I could not help but marvel at the ingenuity of such a method. A poison that leaves no trace, I murmured. Exactly, said Holmes, a most elegant solution for one who wishes to avoid detection. Lestrade began to pace once more. But then, who sent it? He demanded. And how could they be sure that Sir Alistair would be the one to open it? Holmes folded his arms. Ah, he said, now we approach the heart of the matter. He turned his gaze toward the door, as though seeing beyond it. Sir Alistair's final words suggest that he believed the object was not intended for him. That implies that he expected it to be received by someone else. Someone else in the house? I said. Almost certainly, Holmes replied. Which raises a most intriguing possibility. Lestrade stopped pacing. You mean that the intended victim was one of the others? Holmes inclined his head. Consider it, Lestrade. A letter arrives addressed to Sir Alistair, but perhaps intended by design or by expectation to be handled by another. If that person were in the habit of opening his correspondence, then the poison would have reached them instead, I said. Just so. A silence fell upon us as the implications of this began to unfold. Oh, but something went wrong, Lestrade said slowly. Sir Alistair opened it himself. Exactly, Holmes replied. He picked up the card once more, holding it delicately between his fingers. The question then, he continued, is this. Who expected to receive this letter, and why? My thoughts returned at once to the occupants of the drawing-room. The nephew, I said. Or perhaps one of the guests. Holmes nodded. All of whom had opportunity, and perhaps motive, but only one of whom may have anticipated this particular chain of events. He set the card down once more, and turned toward us, his expression now one of quiet determination. We must learn more about their relationships with Sir Alistair, particularly in regard to his correspondence. Lestrade drew a deep breath. And if your theory is correct, Holmes's eyes flashed. Then we are no longer dealing with an impossible crime, he said, but with a most deliberate and calculated act, one in which the evidence was designed not merely to conceal the truth. He paused, his gaze drifting once more to the unfinished note upon the desk, but to reject it entirely. And in that moment I felt that we had at last glimpsed the true nature of the mystery, not as a contradiction of logic, but as its most cunning manipulation. Holmes remained for a few moments in thoughtful silence after his last remark, his gaze resting upon the small card, as though it were the pivot upon which the entire case turned. Then, with a sudden decisiveness, he slipped it carefully into his pocket. "We must proceed with caution," he said. "If my supposition is correct, and we are dealing with a mind both patient and precise, one that anticipates not only events, but interpretations." Lestrade frowned. "You mean the culprit expected us to reach the wrong conclusion?" "More than that," Holmes replied. "They relied upon it." He moved toward the door once again. "Come, Watson, there is still one point upon which we have not yet sufficiently inquired." "And that is?" I asked. "The habits of Sir Alistair," Holmes said, "particularly those relating to his correspondence." We returned to the servants' quarters where Mrs. Wilcox received us once more, her composure now somewhat strained by the repeated questioning. "I hope we are not troubling you unduly," Holmes began with his customary courtesy. "Not at all, sir," she replied, though her voice betrayed fatigue. Holmes inclined his head. I wish only to clarify a small matter. When letters arrived for Sir Alistair, who customarily brought them to him?" "I did, sir," she said. "Or sometimes Carter, if I was occupied." "And were they ever opened before being delivered?" "Never, sir. Sir Alistair was most particular about such things." Holmes nodded. "Quite. And after delivery, did he open them himself?" "Yes, sir, always." Holmes was silent for a moment. "Always," he repeated softly. "Without exception?" Mrs. Wilcox hesitated. "Well, there were occasions when Mr. Edward would glance through the post if his uncle was otherwise engaged." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Indeed? And how frequently did this occur?" "Not often, sir. Only when Sir Alistair requested it." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "And on this particular evening, did Mr. Edward handle any of the letters?" "I could not say, sir," she replied. "I delivered them to the study myself and left Sir Alistair alone." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilcox. You have been most helpful." As we withdrew, Lestrade turned to Holmes with renewed interest. "Well, that seems clear enough," he said. "The old man handled his own correspondence, so if the poison was on that card, it was meant for him after all." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Or meant to appear so." Lestrade stopped short. "Again with your subtleties." Holmes did not reply, but continued on toward the main hall. I followed, sensing that his thoughts had already leapt several steps ahead. "Watson," he said quietly, "what is the essential condition for this method to succeed?" I considered. "That the intended victim must handle the poisoned object." "Precisely. And that requires certainty. Certainty that the object will reach the correct hands." "But if Sir Alistair always opened his own letters, then the plan, as executed, would appear to target him," Holmes finished. "Yes." He paused, then added, "Yet his final words suggest otherwise?" I felt again that sense of unease. "Then either he was mistaken," I said, "or the situation was not as it seemed." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. And it is that discrepancy which must guide us." We had by now reached the foot of the staircase. Holmes stopped and looked upward, his expression thoughtful. "There is another possibility," he said.
Lestrade groaned softly. Another? Holmes ignored him.
Or it's that the letter was not intended for its apparent recipient at all, but for someone who was expected to intercept it. Intercept it? I repeated. Yes, Holmes said. Consider a household in which letters are occasionally handled by more than one person. A pattern may emerge, one that could be observed, studied, and ultimately exploited. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. You mean the sender knew that someone else might open the letter first? Just so. And that someone would then be exposed to the poison? Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. A silence followed, as we each contemplated the implications. But then, Lestrade said slowly, the intended victim must be someone in this house, someone with access to the correspondence. Indeed, said Holmes. My thoughts returned at once to the three individuals we had just left. Mr.
Or Edward, I said, or Mr. Graves, or Miss Whitcomb. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Each of them, he said, has a connection to Sir Alistair and potentially to his affairs, but only one may have had both the opportunity and the expectation necessary for such a plan. Lestrade folded his arms. Then we must find out who. Holmes nodded. And to do so, we must examine not only their movements this evening, but their relationships with the deceased and with one another. He turned toward Lestrade. I should like to know more about Mr. Graves's financial dealings with Sir Alistair. The ledger suggests a degree of involvement that may not be entirely benign. Lestrade made a note. I can have that looked into. And Miss Whitcomb, Holmes continued, her reaction to the note was instructive. Yes, I noticed that, I said. But she seemed startled. More than startled, Holmes replied. She recognized something, whether consciously or not. Lestrade glanced toward the drawing room. You think she knows more than she's saying? I think, said Holmes, that she may hold a piece of the truth, though she may not yet realize its significance. He fell silent for a moment, then added, As for Mr. Edward, his position is, of course, the most obvious. He stands to inherit everything. But as we have already observed, the obvious is often the least reliable guide. Lestrade gave a short nod. Then where do we begin? Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly. We begin, he said, by introducing a small element of pressure. Pressure? Holmes smiled. Yes.
And for if one among them is indeed responsible, or even aware of the truth, then the knowledge that we are drawing near may provoke a reaction. And how do you propose to do that? Lestrade asked. Holmes turned toward the staircase once more. By returning to the drawing room, he said, and presenting them with a version of the facts, one carefully chosen to test their responses. I felt a familiar thrill at this, for I had seen Holmes employ such tactics before, with remarkable success. You intend to mislead them? I asked. Not mislead, Watson, Holmes replied. Merely illuminate. And with that, he began to ascend the stairs, leaving us no choice but to follow. As we approached the drawing room once more, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the brink of some revelation, one that would either confirm Holmes's intricate theory or cast us back into the depths of uncertainty. Holmes paused at the door, his hand upon the handle. Observe closely, he said softly, for it is often in the smallest reaction that the greatest truths are revealed. Then he opened the door, and we entered once more into the presence of those upon whom suspicion now silently rested. The three occupants looked up at our return with varying degrees of apprehension. The atmosphere in the drawing room had altered subtly. Where before there had been uneasy composure, there was now a tension that seemed to tighten at our very entrance. Holmes advanced a few steps into the room, his manner outwardly calm, and yet carrying that quiet authority which I had seen unsettle even the most resolute of men. "I must beg your indulgence once more," he said. "A few additional clarifications have become necessary." Edward Pembroke inclined his head, though I observed that his fingers gripped the back of his chair more firmly than before. "Of course," he said. "Anything that may assist." Holmes gave a faint smile. "I believe it will assist us greatly," he replied. He remained standing, positioning himself so that he could observe all three at once. "We have determined," he continued, "that Sir Alister's death was indeed caused by poison, but not in the manner initially supposed." At this, I saw Graves's gaze sharpen, while Miss Whitcomb drew in a slight breath. "The poison," Holmes went on, "was not contained in his drink nor in his food, and it was conveyed by means far more subtle, through contact with an object placed in his possession." Lestrade shifted slightly beside me, but said nothing. "A letter," Holmes said quietly, "or rather something enclosed within it." The effect was immediate, though varied. Graves' expression remained controlled, yet his eyes flickered for the briefest instant. Edward frowned, as though attempting to follow the reasoning. Miss Whitcomb, however, went visibly pale. Holmes noted it all. "This method," he continued, "is remarkable not only for its ingenuity, but for its reliance upon certainty. The sender must be assured that the intended recipient would handle the object personally." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Yet we have reason to believe that this certainty was misplaced." Edward looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Holmes's gaze rested upon him. "I mean, Mr. Pembroke, that Sir Alister's final words, 'It was not meant for me,' suggest that he believed himself to be an unintended victim." A silence followed. "That is extraordinary," Edward said at last. "Extraordinary, yes," Holmes replied, "but not inexplicable." He turned slightly, his eyes now moving toward Graves. "Mr. Graves, you had business dealings with Sir Alister. You were present this evening. You were aware of his habits." Graves met his gaze steadily. "I fail to see the relevance," he said. Holmes's expression did not change. "On the contrary," he said, "it is entirely relevant, for the success of such a plan depends upon knowledge of routine, of access, of expectation." Graves gave a faint shrug. "You are constructing a very elaborate theory, Mr. Holmes, adding, but I see no evidence to support it." Holmes inclined his head. "Not yet," he said, "but we are approaching it." He shifted his attention once more, this time to Miss Whitcomb. "And you, Miss Whitcomb," he said gently. "You appeared affected when I mentioned Sir Alister's final words earlier." She looked down at her hands. "I was merely distressed," she said. "Distressed," Holmes repeated softly. "Or reminded?" She did not answer. Holmes took a step closer. "You recognize something in those words?" he said. "Something familiar." Her silence deepened, and I could see that she struggled with herself. Holmes did not press immediately. Instead, he turned away slightly, as though allowing her the space to speak of her own accord. "Let us consider another point," he said. "The letter in question bore no indication of its sender. It was delivered among the ordinary post. To all appearances it was unremarkable." He glanced once more at Edward. "And yet, if one were expecting such a letter, if one knew it would arrive, one might take steps to ensure that it passed through one's own hands." Edward's brow furrowed.
You suggest that someone here was expecting this letter? Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. I suggest that it was not sent blindly. Graves gave a short, dry laugh. And you believe that one of us arranged this elaborate scheme to poison another and instead killed Sir Alistair by accident? Holmes turned to him. I believe, he said, that the outcome did not align with the original design. And yet you accuse us, Graves said. I accuse no one, Holmes replied calmly. I merely observe. At this, Miss Whitcomb suddenly rose to her feet.
Oh, I cannot bear this, she said, her voice trembling. It is all too dreadful. Holmes regarded her steadily. Miss Whitcomb, he said, did you receive any correspondence this evening? She froze. No, she said after a moment. Holmes's gaze did not waver. Hey, are you quite certain? Yes, she said, though her voice faltered. Holmes took another step toward her. And yet when I spoke of the letter, you reacted as though it concerned you directly. I did not, she exclaimed. Holmes's voice remained calm. Then perhaps you will explain why. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with visible effort, she spoke. I had been expecting a letter, she said. The room seemed to draw tighter around us. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Indeed, from whom? She hesitated. I cannot say. Holmes's eyes hardened, just a fraction. On the contrary, to Miss Whitcomb, you must. She shook her head. No, I cannot. Holmes was silent for a moment, then spoke with quiet firmness. Then allow me to assist you. The letter you expected, was it connected to Mr. Graves's business dealings with Sir Alistair? Graves stiffened. This is outrageous, he said sharply. Holmes did not look at him. Well, Miss Whitcomb, he pressed. Her composure broke. Yes, she said in a whisper. A stillness fell upon the room. Holmes turned slowly toward Graves. How very interesting, he said. Graves' expression had changed, only slightly, yet enough to betray a flicker of something beneath the surface. You are treading on dangerous ground, Mr. Holmes, he said. Holmes smiled faintly. On the contrary, he replied, I believe I am treading on very solid ground indeed. He glanced once more at Miss Whitcomb. Victor, now, he said, we begin to see how the pieces fit together. I felt then that we stood at a critical juncture, that the careful web Holmes had been weaving was beginning at last to tighten around its unseen centre. And though no accusation had yet been made, I could sense that the truth was drawing nearer, quietly, inexorably, and with a certainty that none in that room could escape. Holmes allowed the silence to linger just long enough to heighten its effect. Miss Whitcomb remained standing, her composure shaken, while Graves watched her with a sharp, calculating expression. Edward Pembroke, for his part, looked from one to the other in growing bewilderment. You expected a letter? Holmes repeated quietly. One connected to Mr. Graves's dealings with Sir Alistair. Miss Whitcomb pressed her hands together. Yes, she said. But I did not know. How could I have known? Holmes raised a hand gently. No one suggests that you did, he said. On the contrary, your reaction confirms that you were not the architect of this design. Graves let out a short breath. This is absurd, he said. You twist every word to suit your theory. Holmes turned to him at last. Do I? He said calmly. Then perhaps you will assist us in clarifying matters. Graves met his gaze with a thin smile. I have already told you everything of relevance. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Then you will have no objection to telling it again. A faint tension passed between them. Very well, Graves said. What is it you wish to know? Holmes stepped closer, his voice lowering just a fraction. "The nature of your arrangement with Sir Alister," he said, "and its connection to Miss Whitcomb." Graves's smile faded. "My business with Sir Alister was entirely separate from Miss Whitcomb." "Was it?" Holmes said. "Then how do you account for her expectation of a letter connected to those dealings?" Graves hesitated, only for a moment, yet long enough. "It was, a matter of correspondence," he said. "Nothing more." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Correspondence of such importance that it required secrecy?" "I said nothing of secrecy." "You implied it," Holmes replied. "By withholding its nature." Graves' composure began to crack. "I see no reason to discuss private matters in this fashion," he said sharply. Holmes's tone remained unaltered. "Private matters have a way of becoming public when they intersect with murder." At this, Edward stepped forward. "Murder?" he said.
You speak as though the matter were already decided." Holmes turned to him. "It is decided," he said. "Only the details remain." Edward looked shaken. "But if what you say is true, if the poison was intended for another, then who was the target?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he looked once more at Miss Whitcomb. "You were expecting a letter?" he said. "Did you anticipate receiving it directly?" She shook her head faintly. "No, I thought Mr. Graves might bring it to me." Holmes' gaze shifted back to Graves. "Ah," he said softly. "Now we approach clarity." Graves' expression hardened. "This is conjecture?" Holmes ignored him. "You expected Mr. Graves to receive the letter," he said to Miss Whitcomb, "and to pass it on to you." "Yes," she whispered. "And why was that?" She hesitated, then spoke with visible effort.
Because it concerned an arrangement, one that Sir Alister did not fully approve of." Holmes nodded slowly. "An arrangement in which Mr. Graves acted as intermediary." "Yes." Holmes turned once more to Graves. "Then it follows," he said, "that any correspondence relating to this matter would be expected to pass through your hands." Graves said nothing. "And if such a letter were to arrive," Holmes continued, "it would be natural, indeed expected, that you would examine it before delivering it to Miss Whitcomb." Graves's silence deepened. Holmes took a step closer. "Unless, of course," he added, "you had reason not to do so." Lestrade, who had thus far remained silent, now spoke. "You mean he avoided opening it?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely." Edward looked from Holmes to Graves. But why would he do that?" Holmes's voice grew quieter still. "Because he knew what it contained?" A sharp intake of breath came from Miss Whitcomb. Graves' composure finally faltered. "That is a lie," he said. Holmes' eyes did not leave him. "Is it?" he said. "Then perhaps you will explain why you did not intercept the letter, why you allowed it to reach Sir Alister instead." "I had no knowledge of any such letter," Graves replied, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Holmes' expression was unwavering. "On the contrary," he said, "you had every reason to expect it. You had established the channel through which such correspondence would flow. You knew that Miss Whitcomb anticipated it. And yet when it arrived you did nothing." Graves took a step back. "You cannot prove any of this." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Proof, mister? Graves is merely the final step. What we have here is something far more compelling, the convergence of fact and inference." He turned slightly, addressing us all. "A poisoned card, delivered in a letter. A recipient who was expected to handle it. An intermediary who would normally intercept such correspondence, but who, on this occasion, did not." His gaze returned to Graves. The simplest explanation, he said, is that you recognized the danger and chose to let it pass. A heavy silence fell. Miss Whitcomb stared at Graves in horror. "You knew?" she said. Graves said nothing. Holmes's voice was now almost gentle. "You did not intend to kill Sir Alistair," he said. "The poison was meant for Miss Whitcomb, but when you realized the nature of the letter, you chose not to intervene." Graves' hands clenched at his sides.
"Yeah, that is not—" Holmes raised a hand. "Pray consider your position carefully before you continue," he said, "for every word you speak may either clarify or condemn." The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Edward looked as though he could scarcely comprehend what he was hearing, while Miss Whitcomb stood pale and trembling. And Holmes, calm, precise and unyielding, stood at the centre of it all, drawing the threads together with inexorable logic. "It remains only," he said quietly, "to determine whether your inaction was born of fear or of intent." At this, Graves's silence became more eloquent than any denial. And I knew then that the truth, long concealed beneath layers of misdirection, was at last beginning to reveal its true and terrible shape. For several moments, no one spoke.
But the weight of Holmes' words seemed to press upon the room with almost physical force. Graves stood rigid, his face pale but set, while Miss Whitcomb looked as though the very ground beneath her had shifted. At length, it was Edward Pembroke who broke the silence. "This is madness," he said hoarsely. "You accuse Mr. Graves of knowing, of allowing such a thing to happen, and yet offer nothing but conjecture." Holmes turned to him with quiet composure. "On the contrary, Mr. Pembroke," he said, "I have offered a chain of reasoning in which each link is supported by fact. If you find it difficult to accept, it is not because it lacks substance, but because its conclusion is uncomfortable." Edward flushed slightly, but said nothing further. Lestrade, however, stepped forward, his practical instincts asserting themselves. "Mr. Graves," he said, "you would do well to answer Mr. Holmes plainly. Did you expect such a letter to arrive?" Graves remained silent. "Did you know what it contained?" Lestrade pressed. At last Graves spoke, though his voice was lower than before. "I knew that something might be sent," he said. Miss Whitcomb gave a faint cry. "You knew?" she repeated. "And you said nothing?" Graves turned toward her, his expression strained. "I was not certain," he said. "I suspected nothing more." Holmes watched him closely. "You suspected that the correspondence might be dangerous," he said. "Dangerous enough to warrant caution." Graves hesitated. "Yes." "And yet," Holmes continued, "you took no steps to prevent it from reaching its destination." "I did not know when it would arrive," Graves replied quickly.
Nor how it would be conveyed." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And when it did arrive?" Graves faltered. I did not see it." Holmes's voice remained calm, but there was now an edge beneath it. "That is not entirely accurate," he said, "for you were aware that Miss Whitcomb was expecting a letter, one which you were to deliver to her. When such a letter appeared among the post, it would naturally attract your attention." Graves's gaze shifted. "I had no opportunity," he said. Holmes took a step closer. "No opportunity or no inclination?" Graves' composure wavered. "You twist everything," he said. Holmes shook his head slightly. "I clarify," he replied, "and in doing so I reveal what has been obscured." He turned briefly to Lestrade. "Inspector,
I believe it would be prudent to have the household post examined more closely, particularly with regard to the time of delivery." Lestrade nodded. "I can arrange that." Holmes inclined his head, then returned his attention to Graves. "There is, however, another aspect which you have not yet addressed," he said. the origin of the poison. Graves said nothing. Holmes continued. This was no common substance. It required knowledge, access, and intent. Such a method is not devised lightly. Miss Whitcomb looked from one to the other in growing distress. "Then who sent it?" she said. If not Mr. Graves, then who?" Holmes's gaze softened slightly as he turned to her. "That, Miss Whitcomb," he said, "is the question upon which the entire matter hinges." Edward stepped forward once more. "You cannot seriously suggest that Mr. Graves orchestrated this," he said. "What possible motive could he have?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "Financial entanglement," he said. "Influence, perhaps even desperation. The ledger suggests that Mr. Graves's dealings with Sir Alistair were not entirely without risk." Graves' expression darkened. "My affairs are my own," he said. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "But when those affairs intersect with a death, they become a matter of interest to us all." A silence followed. Then, quite unexpectedly, Miss Whitcomb spoke again, this time with a quiet firmness that had not been present before. "There is something else," she said. All eyes turned to her. Holmes inclined his head. "Pray continue." She took a breath. "The letter I was expecting, it was not from Mr. Graves," she said.
It was from someone else entirely." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Go on." She hesitated, then continued. "A man named Harrington. He had been corresponding with me regarding certain matters of inheritance." Edward frowned. "Harrington? I have never heard the name." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Nor have I," he said, "which makes him all the more interesting." Lestrade made a note. "We shall have to trace him." Holmes nodded. "Yes, for if this Harrington is indeed connected to the expected letter, then he may also be connected to its fatal contents." Graves shifted slightly. "This is becoming increasingly absurd," he said. "You chase shadows while ignoring the obvious." Holmes turned to him. "On the contrary, Mr. Graves," he said, "I pursue the only path that leads to coherence." He stepped back,
as his gaze moving once more across the room. "Let us review what we know," he continued. "A poisoned card, delivered in a letter, a recipient who was not the intended target, an intermediary who anticipated the correspondence, yet failed to intercept it, and now a third party, previously unmentioned, who may have been the true sender. The pieces once scattered seemed now to draw closer together, though not yet fully aligned. Holmes folded his arms. "It is a delicate construction," he said, "one in which each element depends upon the others. Remove one, and the entire structure shifts." He looked once more at Miss Whitcomb. "This Harrington? Did he have reason to harm you?" She shook her head. "No, I cannot imagine why." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then perhaps," he said, "the motive lies not with you, but with someone else entirely." Lestrade looked up. "You mean Sir Alistair?" Holmes's eyes flickered. "Possibly, or perhaps the motive has been concealed behind the appearance of misdirection, just as the method was." He paused, then added, "In any case, we must not assume that the intended victim was Miss Whitcomb merely because she expected the letter. That assumption may itself be part of the design." A murmur of uncertainty passed through the room. Holmes, however, seemed undisturbed. "The truth," he said quietly, "is close at hand, but it will not yield itself to haste. We must proceed with care, lest we fall into the very trap that has been so skillfully laid." And as I looked upon the faces around me, each marked by doubt, fear, unguarded resolve, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the very edge of revelation. Yet even now the final piece remained just beyond our grasp. Holmes did not immediately pursue Miss Whitcomb's revelation further. Instead, he turned away from the group and moved slowly toward the mantel, his fingers lightly brushing its edge as though tracing some invisible outline. I had seen this manner in him before, when the final alignment of facts hovered just beyond articulation. "Harrington," he murmured softly, a name introduced late, yet positioned to attract attention. Lestrade looked up from his notes. "You think it a false lead?" he asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he turned back, his gaze moving deliberately from one face to another. "Miss Whitcomb," he said.
"This Harrington, how long have you been in correspondence with him?" She hesitated. "Several weeks," she replied. "Perhaps longer." "And you have never met him?" "No." Holmes inclined his head. "Then your knowledge of him is entirely dependent upon letters." "Yes." Holmes folded his arms. "And those letters, did they concern matters of inheritance, as you stated?" "They did." Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. "Curious," he said. "For Sir Alistair himself was the principal authority upon such matters within this household." Edward shifted slightly. "My uncle managed all such affairs personally," he said. "Precisely," Holmes replied, "which raises the question, why would an external party correspond directly with Miss Whitcomb on such a subject rather than addressing Sir Alistair himself?" Miss Whitcomb looked uncertain.
I did not question it," she said. Holmes nodded. "Few would," he said, "which makes it all the more effective." Lestrade frowned. "You think this Harrington never existed?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "On the contrary, I think he existed precisely as required." A silence followed. "You mean an invention?" I said. "An identity," Holmes corrected gently, "constructed for a purpose." He turned once more toward Graves. "And I suspect," he added, "that purpose brings us back to you, Mr. Graves." Graves stiffened. "This is preposterous," he said. "You now accuse me of fabricating entire correspondences?" Holmes's gaze was steady. "I accuse you of nothing yet," he said. "But I observe that you had both the means and the opportunity to do so." Edward looked from one to the other. "But to what end?" he demanded. Holmes stepped forward slightly. "I'm to establish expectation," he said, "to create a pattern, to ensure that when a particular letter arrived, its handling would follow a predictable course." Miss Whitcomb's eyes widened. "You mean the letters from Harrington were meant to prepare me?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. To accustom you to receiving correspondence through Mr. Graves, to ensure that any future letter would be anticipated and therefore trusted." Graves shook his head. "This is fantasy," he said. "You build castles upon air." Holmes' expression hardened just a fraction. "Do I?" he said quietly. "Then perhaps you will explain why this Harrington, so diligent in his correspondence, has left no trace beyond Miss Whitcomb's letters, no business address, no known associates, no record whatsoever." Graves said nothing. Holmes continued. "A phantom correspondent, a poisoned letter, a deviation in routine, and a death that appears at first glance to contradict itself. It is not fantasy, Mr. Graves, it is design." Lestrade stepped forward. "If this is true," he said, "then the intended victim was indeed Miss Whitcomb, and Sir Alistair's death was accidental." Holmes raised a finger. "Not so fast," he said. "We must be precise." He turned once more to Miss Whitcomb. "When you expected this letter, did you intend to open it yourself?" "Yes," she said faintly. "And where would you have done so?" "In the drawing-room, or perhaps in my chambers." Holmes nodded. "Not in the study?" "No." Holmes' eyes gleamed. Then Sir Alistair's presence in the study and his handling of the letter was not merely unfortunate, it was anomalous. Edward frowned. My uncle always opened his own letters." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Which brings us to the crucial point." He paused, allowing the significance of his words to gather. The plan, as constructed, could not have succeeded unless Sir Alistair himself became the recipient. A murmur passed through the room. "But that contradicts," Lestrade began. Holmes shook his head. "It clarifies," he said. He stepped closer to the desk once more, as though addressing an unseen audience. The poisoned card was sent with the expectation that it would pass through Mr. Graves's hands, and from there to Miss Whitcomb. That much is clear, but Sir Alistair, contrary to that expectation, opened the letter himself. He turned sharply, and in doing so he disrupted the design. Graves' voice came low and strained. "You cannot prove that." Holmes met his gaze. "I know," he said. "But I can prove something far more decisive." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the card once more. "This object," he said, "was not merely a delivery mechanism. It was a message intended for a specific recipient." He held it up to the light. "And yet, when Sir Alistair encountered it, his reaction was immediate, not one of confusion, but of recognition." Miss Whitcomb gasped softly. Holmes's voice dropped. "He wrote, 'It was not meant for me.'" Not because he believed himself an unintended victim, but because he recognized that the message was not addressed to him. A stillness fell. Edward stared at him. "You mean—" "He knew?" Holmes inclined his head. He understood, in that instant, that the letter belonged to another, and in that understanding he perceived the danger. Too late. Lestrade exhaled slowly. Then the plan failed." Holmes's eyes flashed. "On the contrary," he said, "it succeeded, though not in the manner intended." He turned once more to Graves. For whether by design or by negligence, the result was the same, a death achieved without trace, and a web of evidence so contradictory that it appeared to deny itself. Graves' composure had all but vanished now. "You have nothing," he said. Holmes regarded him steadily. "I have enough," he replied. He glanced briefly at Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe we are now in a position to proceed, though one final detail remains to be addressed before the full truth may be laid bare." Lestrade nodded. "And that is?" Holmes's gaze returned to Graves, sharp and unwavering. "The question of intent," he said quietly.
And in that lies the difference between accident and murder." And as I looked upon the man before us, his confidence eroded, his silence now heavy with implication, I felt that we stood upon the very brink of revelation. Only one step remained. Holmes allowed his final words to settle upon the room like a closing net. No one spoke. Even Lestrade, whose patience was seldom equal to his determination, remained still, as though instinctively aware that interruption at this moment would shatter something delicate and precise. Holmes turned once more toward the desk, his long fingers resting lightly upon its surface. "We have arrived," he said quietly, "at the point where conjecture must give way to certainty." He faced them all. "Let us consider the sequence, not as it appeared, but as it was." He began to pace slowly, each step measured,
on each word deliberate. "A series of letters written under the name of Harrington establishes a pattern. Miss Whitcomb comes to expect correspondence of a particular nature, confidential, perhaps delicate. That correspondence passes naturally through the hands of Mr. Graves, who has positioned himself as intermediary." Graves said nothing. His eyes remained fixed upon Holmes. "Then," Holmes continued, "a final letter is prepared, one unlike the others. Within it, a card treated with a volatile poison designed to act upon contact. The intention is clear. Miss Whitcomb receives the letter, opens it, and is struck down without trace. Miss Whitcomb shuddered visibly. Holmes's voice softened slightly. But the plan required one critical assumption, that the letter would follow the established path, that Mr. Graves would intercept it.
And pass it along. He stopped. But on this occasion, he did not. Lestrade leaned forward. Because he suspected, he said. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. Mr. Graves, having devised, or at the very least recognized the nature of the scheme, chose not to intervene. Whether out of fear, calculation, or something darker, he allowed the letter to proceed unimpeded. Graves's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. And so, Holmes went on, the letter reached Sir Alister Pembroke, who by habit and authority opened his own correspondence. Edward closed his eyes briefly. My uncle, he murmured. Holmes continued, his tone unwavering. Upon handling the card, Sir Alister is exposed to the poison. The effect is immediate. In that instant he understands, not fully perhaps, but enough.
And he recognizes that the letter was not intended for him. He attempts to record this realization. It was not meant for me. But death overtakes him before he can complete the thought. A heavy silence filled the room. Lestrade spoke at last. And the poison leaves no trace, because it dissipates. Exactly, Holmes said. A method chosen precisely for that reason, to leave behind evidence that contradicts itself, to suggest impossibility where there is only ingenuity. He turned then, his gaze settling once more upon Graves. And now, Mr. Graves, we come to you. Graves stood rigid, his composure shattered. You have described a plan, he said hoarsely, but you have not proved that I was responsible for it. Holmes regarded him steadily. No, he said.
I have done something far more decisive. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small card once more. This, he said, was not merely a weapon, but a clue. Its preparation required knowledge, chemical knowledge to be precise. And among those present, only one individual possesses both the means and the motive to employ such a method. Graves' eyes flickered. You, Holmes said quietly, have been engaged in speculative ventures which, according to Sir Alister's ledger, have placed you in considerable financial jeopardy. Miss Whitcomb, through her connection to certain inheritances, represented a potential solution to that difficulty. Miss Whitcomb gasped. You mean? Holmes inclined his head. Yes. Her death would have altered the disposition of those funds which Mr. Graves was in a position to influence. Graves's voice rose, strained and desperate. That is conjecture. Holmes did not raise his voice. Is it? Then how do you explain the letters, written in a hand that matches your own, disguised but not sufficiently so to escape analysis? How do you explain your knowledge of Miss Whitcomb's expectations? And how do you explain your decision, your very deliberate decision, not to intercept the final letter? Graves's silence was answer enough. Lestrade stepped forward. I think that will do, he said grimly, but Holmes raised a hand. One moment more, he said. He looked directly at Graves. You did not intend to kill Sir Alister, he said. But you allowed it to happen. You recognized the danger and chose inaction. That, Mr. Graves, is not merely negligence, it is complicity. Graves's shoulders sagged. Whatever resistance remained in him seemed to drain away. I did not think, he began. No, Holmes said quietly. You did not. Lestrade placed a hand upon Graves's shoulder. You will come with me, he said. Graves did not resist. As he was led from the room, Miss Whitcomb sank into her chair, her face pale with shock.
Edward stood motionless, as though struggling to reconcile the man he had known with the truth now laid bare. Holmes remained where he was, his expression composed, almost detached. "It is done," he said softly. Later, as we rode back through the thinning fog toward Baker Street, I could not help but reflect upon the singular nature of the case. "A most extraordinary affair," I said. "A crime in which the evidence seemed to deny itself entirely." Holmes gave a faint smile. "On the contrary, Watson," he said, "the evidence was perfectly consistent. It was merely arranged to mislead." "And Sir Alistair's final words?" I asked. "They were true, yet misunderstood." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "Truth, when incomplete, may serve falsehood as readily as fact." He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. "It is the task of the investigator," he added, "to distinguish between the two." I looked at him with renewed admiration. "You make it sound almost simple." Holmes's eyes opened, and there was the faintest glimmer of amusement within them. "My dear Watson," he said, "there is nothing simple about truth. It is merely inevitable." And with that, he turned his gaze toward the window, where the last remnants of fog drifted away into the London night, leaving behind a clarity as sharp and unmistakable as the solution he had so masterfully revealed.